Good afternoon, everyone. It's so wonderful for you all to be here. Emily and I want to welcome you all to this tribute to our great father, Arnold Mayer, who did so much for us and for so many over all of these years. We chose this particular venue for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's an open-air place where people can relax together in the time of COVID. And number two, its panoramic proportions mirrors Arnold's life. Arnold arrived in Washington over there in Union Station back in 1952 to seek his fortunes and contribute to making the world a better place. And over there at the Capitol was where he focused much of his work, helping to shape national legislation on behalf of the American worker. So we gather here in view of his point of arrival and one of his centers of activity, ready to reflect on and celebrate Arnold and his rather epic life.
Beloved husband, father, cousin, friend, and colleague, may this time we spend together remembering Arnold inspire us to greater heights of hope that we can still make this country and even the world a better place. We'll begin our tribute to Arnold with a 15-minute movie we made about Arnold's life. After that, we'll move on to our program of speakers. And finally, we'll spend time together enjoying food and drink with wine from Arnold's own cellar, no less. So, thank you again for joining us here as we celebrate Arnold's life.
Father, husband, cousin, son, grandfather, friend, advocate for the American worker, the working poor, the immigrant, all-around wonderful human being with a big heart, loyal, generous spirit, and brilliant strategic mind. Arnold Mayer was also a storyteller. Over the years, we heard many of his life stories and thought to gather them together with pictures and words on this occasion of tribute. Arnold saw himself as a lucky guy, stating, "Hitler did me a favor. By kicking us out of Germany, he made it possible for me to choose the life I wanted to live." So here's the story of the life he chose to live. Born June 19, 1930, Arnold grew up Jewish in the small German town of Ober-Ulm, a close-knit village where everyone in the region knew everything about everyone else. The Mayer family had lived in the town since the 1700s, and his father's family owned a cloth business. His father Fritz, veteran of the German army and true Rhinelander, was well-liked with an irreverent sense of humor, a deep sense of justice, and a desire to fix everything that seemed broken to him. His mother Anna was conservative and realistic, believing in duty and obligation, the world a series of concentric circles with her family in the center. Over the course of the 1930s, life in Ober-Ulm and all of Germany became increasingly difficult for Jews. Arnold described how the Jewish kids had to run home from school to avoid getting beaten up by the local Nazis. In 1935, the village priest took Fritz aside, admitting that he couldn't protect the Jews in the village anymore, and it was necessary for them to come up with a new plan. So Fritz contacted his cousin Elsa in the U.S., who'd found a distant relative, a wealthy hat manufacturer, who'd agreed to sponsor Fritz's family once they came to America on the condition that they never contact them. Fritz and Anna began the process of wrapping up their life in Ober-Ulm. In September 1938, the house in Ober-Ulm sold and the Sudeten crisis temporarily resolved. Fritz, Anna, and 8-year-old Arnold boarded the New York-bound ocean liner the SS President Harding. Unfortunately, Fritz and Anna spent the voyage in their cabin, seasick, but Arnold enjoyed the run of the ship, taking himself to breakfast and being addressed as Herr Mayer by the waitstaff. It was an exciting adventure. At the Immigrant Processing Center in Hoboken, New Jersey, Arnold stood in line with his mother during the health screening, noticing there was an eye chart that everyone had to read from. Arnold had terrible eyesight, even as a very young child, but recognized the potential high stakes, so he listened carefully, memorizing the order of letters. Arnold often paid very close attention as if his life depended upon it, because sometimes it did.
In the U.S., the Mayers moved to the Bronx to live with Mayer cousins Margaret, Albie, and Eleanor. Arnold and his parents stayed in the Bronx only briefly, however, because Fritz heard there were jobs in Bridgeport, Connecticut. So the Mayer family moved, renting a second-story apartment and a triple-decker walk-up from a kindly old Jewish couple who'd watch Arnold while his parents attended night school to learn English. The old man even fixed up a cathedral radio, a Rosh Hashanah present, for Arnold to listen to music, news, and radio shows. Anna found work as a maid, and Fritz worked as a longshoreman and then as a lathe operator in a factory. Arnold learned English at school, on the playground, and from the neighborhood kids playing in the street. Skinny, scrappy, and prepared to defend the honor of his people, Arnold got into his fair share of fights. Eventually, no one would fight him not because he could beat anyone physically, but because he would never give up. Because of Arnold's lousy eyesight, the school recommended a special sight savings class and his parents complied. Arnold was bused to a school across town and was very bored. He caused no trouble and read every book twice in the class library. He wanted nothing more than to be back in school with the other neighborhood kids. After his bar mitzvah, Fritz said to him, "Now you are a man. You can make decisions on your own. What decisions would you like to make?" Arnold, who already thought about this, stated, "Number 1, I want to quit Hebrew school the day after my bar mitzvah, and number 2, I'm going back to the neighborhood school." Fritz agreed to both of them. As a young teen, Arnold worked as a paper boy and once he turned 16 in a toy factory. Factory work was easy but extremely boring to him. He knew he didn't want to do this for the rest of his life. Unlike his dad and cousin Albie, Arnold wasn't good at fixing things, but he was good at school. So Arnold buckled down and he worked hard to do well.
During his junior year of high school, Arnold sometimes submitted short articles to the Bridgeport Herald's youth page. The city editor liked Arnold's stories and said he should apply for one of the jobs they just opened to local teens. Arnold got the job, taking a pay cut from 80 cents an hour in the factory to 60 cents at the paper, but it was a step up. Arnold had eagerly followed the news since he was a kid, knowing that what was going on in the world was vitally important to his family's survival, and he had dreams of becoming a great reporter. Ultimately, he worked for 5 years at the paper, till he got his first job in Washington. Late in high school one day, a neighbor, Mrs. Kearns, whose kids he knew from school, encouraged Arnold to apply for the Connecticut High School Scholarship that her son had won to Yale University. Between his work as a teen reporter, his high position in his graduating class, his service as class treasurer, and acing the state American history test, Arnold won the scholarship. Arnold's Yale years were educational in all sorts of ways. He was challenged academically and grew as a researcher and writer. But perhaps more importantly, he was exposed to a part of American culture, prep school kids and academics, that he never would have encountered otherwise as a working-class Jewish kid. As Arnold put it, Yale was my preparation for life. I felt very much an outsider. I made friends, but they were different from me. In his junior year, when he read J.D. Salinger's new novel, The Catcher in the Rye, just like Holden Caulfield, Arnold wanted to be the catcher in the rye, catching everybody before they went over the edge of the cliff. Arnold graduated magna cum laude with a BA in history.
While Arnold's mom urged him to pursue a law degree, Arnold wanted nothing of it. He still harbored the desire to be a great newspaperman. However, he lamented, much to my surprise, the great newspapers of the world were not waiting for me when I finished Yale. Happily, through a personal connection, he landed a job in the U.S. Information Agency's news service, where he worked until a newly elected President Eisenhower made a peace treaty with Germany and Austria, and the newspaper folded. Arnold was once again looking for a job. Not knowing what to do next, Arnold briefly considered graduate school but had no interest in pursuing a life in academia. Through a friend from his Herald days, Arnold heard of a job in Washington, D.C. in a newly formed public relations firm. Arnold got the job and worked in PR for 3 years, doing public relations for such diverse outfits as George Washington University and the Postal Workers Union. In working closely with the lobbyists for the postal workers to increase pay, Arnold recognized he wanted to work for the labor movement. At 24, Arnold went for an interview with Leon Schachter, a Romanian-born Jew who moved up the ranks from meat cutter to vice president of the Amalgamated Meat Cutters and Butchers Workmen's Union. Arnold found in Leon a brilliant mentor, a big brother figure, and a friend for life. Leon taught him about organizing and strategy, and Arnold did the publicity for the meat cutters.
Their first big campaign was for poultry inspection. It was here that Arnold began learning how Capitol Hill worked and how legislative change was made. A senator from Montana, chair of the Senate Labor Committee, advised him how to get poultry inspection into the papers and into the hearts and minds of the American people. Arnold got a piece published in Red Book magazine that was embarrassing to the poultry industry. To quell the bad publicity, the poultry lobby backed down and the inspection bill passed. This was Arnold's first great legislative victory. During the 60s and 70s, he went on to fight for social justice and welfare, minimum wage, civil rights, and consumer protection. He led successful lobbying campaigns for clean foods, farm labor rights, food stamp programs, and better minimum wage protection. On March 8, 1957, while waiting to testify at a congressional hearing, Arnold noticed a young woman marching around the room. As he put it, she not only was attractive, but she even seemed to know what she was doing, a confidence I did not possess. I found out who she was and decided I should meet her. Vera was head of the National Consumers League and was also attending law school at GW at night. They started dating and, on March 29, 1959, married in a small ceremony at Addis, Israel. They moved into an apartment in Woodley Park, and Arnold continued his work for the Meat Cutters Union, while Vera served as staff attorney in the anti-poverty program and worked to help set up the Medicare program in 1965.
Arnold and Vera soon bought an old, charming house in the Forest Hills section of Washington. Vera quit working full-time when they adopted 3-week-old Anna Sarah, named for Arnold's mother and Vera's grandmother, Sarah. 4 years later, in 1971, they adopted Emily Frederica, named for Arnold's grandma, Emma, and his father. Arnold and Vera provided a fun, enriching home, both cozy and exciting. Great food. Vera loved to cook, and Arnold pan-grilled a mean steak. Bike rides on the C&O Canal, trips to Kitty Hawk with the Spielberg cousins, trips to Lake of the Woods to visit the Mayer Rund cousins, along with many years of seders, Thanksgivings, and dinner parties with friends and family. The Mayer House on 30th Street was welcoming, entertaining, and mentally stimulating for family and friends alike. Arnold and Vera were a great couple, partners in crime, partners for life. In 1979, a merger of the meat cutters and retail clerks formed the United Food and Commercial Workers Union and allowed Arnold the opportunity to run for union office. He won a vice presidency in 1980 and was easily re-elected twice thereafter. He was proud of this achievement and added the UFCW's $2.5 million biennial Political Action Fund program to his lobbying work. After 10 years, Arnold retired. As he put it, the Reagan years of playing legislative defense had taken their toll, and I was tired. For the next decade, Arnold did consulting work for do-good organizations and some unions, especially OCAW and FRAC, while also supporting Vera in her work with Iona Senior Services and on the DC Board of Nursing. During these years, they also traveled, both by themselves and with friends. They enjoyed trips in the U.S. and abroad, visiting their daughters in New Mexico and Southern California, seeing the Pacific Northwest, heading to Montana to see Dick and Barbara Warden, as well as taking elder hostel tours of Scandinavia, Central Europe, Ireland, and Scotland. Arnold eventually retired from his consulting work, and at 81, Vera retired from her advocacy work. They spent time with their children and grandchildren in LA and DC, as well as summers with their extended family, renting houses at a nearby lake or beach. Arnold and Vera were active in their neighborhood dog group that met at the park, and Arnold went for regular lunches with buddies Ken Young and Dick Warden. They kept up with old friends, Del Goldberg, Jackie Kinsley, Marjorie Racklin, Noreen Martin, and other folks in the neighborhood, as well as both younger and older cousins, the Runns and Spielbergs. While Arnold stayed sharp mentally, Vera began having problems with memory and started showing signs of dementia. By 2020, at the height of the pandemic, caregivers Fina and Gideon started providing in-home help. After Vera fell and broke her hip, she entered Manor Care Potomac, where she still lives, and Arnold joined her once his care became too difficult at home. After 3 months, progressively frail and weak, Arnold succumbed to pneumonia after a brief illness. The lion of labor had been laid low. But just like in the old song, Joe Hill, from San Diego up to Maine, in every mine and mill, where working men defend their rights, it's there you'll find Joe Hill. Or Arnold Mayer. Hitler really did him and other American working people a favor by kicking him out of Germany. Not only did he find a better life for himself and his family, he contributed to the betterment of the lives of working Americans everywhere.
I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Says I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, says he. I never died, says he.
It's both an honor and a little daunting to try to do justice to Arnold and everything he did. As you all know, Arnold often deflected praise. He wasn't someone who was a self-promoter, but he was one of the finest, most wonderful, most extraordinary people I've ever met. He was the greatest lobbyist and legislative strategist on behalf of social justice I ever had the privilege of working closely with. He was whip smart. He would grasp the essentials of issues really quickly, immediately develop detailed, creative legislative strategies, sometimes even involving Republicans Arnold had built relationships with, and he'd enlist colleagues and others to execute the strategies flawlessly. He combined tremendous skill with a quiet passion and a deep dedication to improving working conditions for millions of workers, strengthening labor unions, and combating poverty and hardship across the country. In its now nearly 60-year history, the food stamp program, now called SNAP, never had a greater or more effective champion on Capitol Hill. His behind-the-scenes impact on behalf of the program, especially in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, was second to none. Now, I think there were a number of reasons why Arnold was so extraordinarily effective at what he did. One of them was who he was. He was a wonderful human being. He was thoughtful, he was kind and generous. He was often understated. He did not carry himself as though he was someone important, although he really was. He was so warm and genuine that he struck up these friendships and alliances all over Capitol Hill. I remember how surprised I was when he first brought me into a few meetings he had on Capitol Hill, and I saw him talking to members of Congress and calling them by their first names. But then I realized that there was this really genuine affection between Arnold and lots of members and lots of senators. For me personally, to say that Arnold was a special person doesn't begin to express it. Arnold Mayer changed my life. I met him in late 72 or early 73 when I was a staff writer on a tiny little newsletter on food issues called the CNI Weekly Report, to which Arnold contributed an occasional column under a pseudonym. I didn't know him, but one day I gingerly approached him. I can still picture it in my mind. I remember saying, "Mr. Mayer, I don't know anything much about these issues, but if there's any way I could do anything to help you in your work on food stamps on the Hill, I'd be interested in doing that." He could have very politely demurred. I had just come to Washington. I didn't know anything about Washington. I didn't know anything about food stamps. I didn't really know much about anything I was doing other than writing a few little articles each week for this newsletter. But instead, Arnold took me under his wing and began to teach me. He took me with him to meetings on Capitol Hill, and after the meetings, he'd explain to me what had happened, why he had handled it the way he did, and what it all meant. He and the late John Kramer became my mentors and guides. He started introducing me to people. He even introduced me to Tom Foley, or Heather sitting here, who became another mentor. You know, talking about Tom Foley, my last conversation with Tom comes to mind. Heather, you called me to come to the house and say goodbye to Tom. He had about 24 hours left to live. And when I tried to talk to Tom about his extraordinary impact in reducing hunger in the United States, Tom wouldn't hear of it. He said he was just part of a broader effort, which of course was a gross understatement of Tom Foley's amazing contributions. But Tom said to me, it was a team that worked together to accomplish so much on hunger. And he then started to talk about the team, and the very first person he mentioned, the first member of the team, was Arnold Mayer. Arnold, often with his so close colleagues and friends, Dick Warden and Ken Young, made contributions on so many fronts that made millions of people's lives better, from improving conditions for meat packers to fighting for the fair treatment of farm workers, to his work on the minimum wage and the part I was fortunate enough to see firsthand, his tremendous work for decades as the key strategist on how to expand and strengthen food stamps and fight hunger in the country. Today, I don't know the latest number, but something like close to 40 million people get food stamps. We have all this research showing that when poor children receive food stamps, they do better in school, they grow up healthier, they're more successful as adults. This program, now one of the most important in the country, never would have become what it is today without Arnold Mayer. I could say so much more, but let me just close with a story involving Arnold from the late 1970s. This is a story that unfolded late one night when the Senate Budget Committee was marking up that year's budget resolution, back in the days when the Budget Committee in the Senate often did its markups at night. Arnold and I were there because an amendment was coming up in the markup to cut food stamps deeply by slashing the benefit amount for families in which children got free school meals, a so-called anti-double dipping amendment, if you can believe it. Arnold had counted the votes. He had talked to everyone. We had the amendment beat, but by only one vote. And then a senator who was one of our votes left for the evening. Now, in that markup, there were no proxy votes allowed. And Arnold said to me, Bob, we cannot afford to lose a single other senator who's with us. You know, Bob, that my eyesight isn't so good. You have to let me know immediately if any of our senators get up to leave. Well, around 10 p.m., the venerable Warren Magnuson, 80 years old, the chairman of a couple of other committees, got up and left the room. I got to Arnold and he said to me, we have to catch Senator Magnuson. Where is he? I said, well, Arnold, he's already in the hallway making his way towards the elevators. Arnold jumped up out of his chair. We have to go after him. Well, we got to the hallway and Magnuson was far down the corridor on the 6th floor of the Dirksen building, way down the hallway. Arnold and I began running after him. But I exclaimed, I said, my God, Arnold, he's almost at the elevators. Arnold said, well, let's run faster. So we're running as fast as we can. Magnuson's just about at the elevators. Arnold decides, I've got to yell out to him before he gets on the elevator. Arnold, by this point, we're totally out of breath. But Arnold says, please, gasping for breath, Mr. Chairman, hungry children, Mr. Chairman. Please, Mr. Chairman, don't go, Mr. Chairman. Magnuson stops in his tracks. He looks amazed at Arnold. He looks at me. He looks back at Arnold. He says, fellas, I'm only going to the men's room. For a second, Arnold and I were chagrined and embarrassed. But mainly, we were happy because Senator Magnuson returned to the committee and he helped us beat the bad amendment by one vote. But that was the indefatigable Arnold. It's so hard to think of his no longer being with us. But in so many ways, I think Arnold endures. He lives on in our memories of him, in the ways that he helped many of us become who we are, and in the lives of millions of people all across the country whose lives are better because of what this man, Arnold Mayer, did and did so very well. Thank you, Anna Sarah and Emily, for giving me the opportunity to speak today about this man who was such a truly great human being. Thank you.
Oh, good evening. Arnold has always been a prime role model in my life. He was someone who always taught me to believe in myself and work your very hardest to achieve your dreams. No matter the dream, if there is a will, there is a way. I think of him when making several important decisions throughout my life. And in honor of him and his teachings, I will continue to work my hardest to achieve my own dreams in the future. I'm forever proud to be his very first grandchild and also a member of the UFCW. Thank you for everything, Grandpa Arnold. I love you forever.
Ooh, okay. Don't have my own strength. Good evening, everyone. I'm TJ Wittenhofer, second eldest grandchild. And did you introduce yourself, Theo? That was Theodora, eldest grandchild. And I guess I'll start. My grandfather was an amazing man, as I'm sure you're all well aware from what Theo said, what Bob Greenstein has said from the video. I'm sure we're all aware of how wonderful he was. He lived a full, loving, very eventful life. He lived a life not everyone gets to live, doing all the work that he did. And although I'm sure none of us were quite ready for it to be over yet, he got so much done, it only makes sense to let him rest now, after everything he's done for all of us. Not only was he incredibly active, both physically, politically, mentally, he was also brave, headstrong, and creative. It couldn't be truer of me to say that he helped shape me into the person that I am today, the one standing before you here. Creative, bold, argumentative, and never quite willing to go down without a fight. I remember times where I would listen to him tell us stories that would always follow this specific pattern. I even picked up on it as a child, that's how simple they were. But even then, he would commend us for picking up on it, for understanding that there was a plot, the beginning, the middle, the end, understanding that these characters were tropes that he had taught us. The thing is, though, when it's someone like Arnold Mayer speaking, it's hard not to pick up on those things. It's hard to ignore anything else he might have to say. I remember that one of the first times, though, that we ever gotten into an argument that held any weight in my own heart was when I had told him I would be taking German come 6th grade. I would have been 11 years old at this point, and even then I was ready to go down with that ship of, I will take German and there's nothing you can do to say about it. He had said something along the lines of how German's a language I'll never use in my day-to-day life, that I'll never use it professionally. How I should learn something more helpful like Spanish, like my mother and my aunt had, or she had learned French as opposed to Spanish. And even then, I still decided, no, German's what I'm going to be taking. The main reason I ended up taking German was because I wanted to be able to talk to him in his mother tongue, in his native language. That was something I felt he deserved at any stage of his life. He should be able to talk to someone in a language that he knew, a language that he spoke from the moment he was alive. I was young, but I was not naive, and I knew I wouldn't get this chance for very long, so it was something I was steadfast on and did not change. And even to this day, I don't regret that decision. And then there would also be times as he got older, he would tell us the same stories over and over again, but these are stories from his past as opposed to the fictional ones he would make up on the spot. But we would never interrupt him. I would never interrupt him. No one would ever interrupt him to tell him he's telling us the same story all over again. How could you, though, when it's someone like him? And it always seemed that with every story he told, every retelling of it, he would always remember something new to tell us, and it would give us a reason to not interrupt. He would tell us stories from his past, be it his college days, at Yale, and how he got in full scholarship, his time with the Meat Cutters Union and how they were paying his pension, or even his interactions with the now President Joe Biden and all his, let's call it, complicated feelings towards him. He would remember a new detail, and like a sponge in an abandoned well, I would absorb every little thing he said, like it was a new monsoon. He would mention his days at Capitol Hill, the times he got arrested during strikes, and I would listen intently, my brain being molded by his words into the mindset that I have now. He is the reason that I myself, and I'm sure many of us, are so pro-union, so pro-workers' rights, so pro-humanitarianism, so socialist, for lack of a better word, despite the fact he would never use that word himself to describe him. My grandfather, Arnold Mayer, friend, husband, father, true man, intentionally or not, laid the groundwork for anyone who met him, talked to him, simply gazed upon him, to follow in his footsteps. Here's to hoping that none of us get lost.
First of all, let me thank Anna, Sarah, and Emily for inviting me here to speak about Arnold. Hearing the things that I just heard about Arnold, obviously I knew many of them, but it brings a new meaning to what Arnold was. There's an expression I recall, ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Arnold Mayer was a friend of mine for more than 55 years. I met Arnold in the first months that I was working on the staff of Local 56 for the Meat Cutters Union in New Jersey. As it happened, the president of Local 56 was Leon Schachter. He gave me my first union job ever. Later, I learned from Arnold that Leon, some 11 years earlier, had given Arnold his first ever union job. As an organizer, you learn to do things, and you learn from Schachter. What's interesting is the both of us hired by him, our first job, both became international vice presidents. Now, some say that's because we had talent and he saw it. Others say he was just a great teacher. I think in Arnold, he saw talent. In me, I got lucky and he taught me. And I appreciate that. While Arnold and I came from very different worlds and backgrounds, he from New England by way of Germany, me from New Jersey by way of Central Florida, Sanford, we both had to leave our places of birth. My father got tired in the 1940s of seeing the abuse that blacks took in Florida. But that was nothing compared to what Arnold Mayer saw in Germany. But it still gave us a kinship of things that we remembered about each other. Dinner at the mayor's house was always interesting. Arnold had opinions about lots of things. And sometimes, and Sarah and Emily, he was even right. But the thing about it was, even if I thought he was wrong, I could follow the logic that got him to where he was. Because he didn't just have some crazy ideas. He had a logical, well thought out reason why he was saying what he was saying. At those dinners, Arnold, someone mentioned he was going to have, the wine is from his cellar. Well, he kind of thought he was a connoisseur of wines, and he may have been. I don't drink, so I didn't know. But Arlene and I, my wife Arlene, who was sitting over here laughing, bought him a bottle of wine at his house. And when he saw the label, he looked at it and said, "Oh, no, we can't drink this wine with this dinner. This is a great wine. We'll take it to your house the next time we have dinner, and we'll drink it there." Well, the next time we did, he and Arlene opened the wine. They both sampled it, and they both decided, this wine ain't no good, folks. They didn't enjoy the wine, but they did enjoy the big laugh that wine gave them. At another dinner at our house, he decided he wanted to meet Eliseo Medina, who was at that time the Secretary-Treasurer of SEIU. So we invited Eliseo over and Arnold. Eliseo had worked for the Farm Workers Union as an organizer, so Arnold was fascinated by that. And while I watched them, I watched these two lions of the American labor movement swap stories and tell what they did and why they did it, and the stories about Cesar Chavez. It's just fascinating. It could be a class for a college student to learn about the American labor movement. I also learned that Arnold did a lot of work. One other thing he did, he and Vera had a fireplace, and we cut down a tree at one time. And they wanted firewood. So I said, sure, Arnold, come over. You can have all you want. They drove over in a car. Now, if you're going to load firewood, you get yourself a pickup truck or you get yourself a van. But we put a blanket in the back of the car and we put as much wood as we could in there, and they took it home and burned it for a long time, I guess. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Arnold, most of you who knew him after 1970 saw this very fit, healthy man. When I first met him, that was not the Arnold Mayer I met. He started going to the gym. When I came to the USCW International office in '85, I made the mistake of going to the gym with him a couple of times. Now, I was an athlete in college and high school. I followed Arnold on the machines. He had the weight on it, and he did the stuff with it, and then it was my turn. And I discovered I wasn't as strong as I thought I was. This frail man who's at least 12 years older than me was doing stuff I could no longer do. That was the Arnold Mayer I knew. In the end, well, the last half of the 20th century, Arnold Mayer played a major role in making America a better place to live. In the end, it's not what you believe in, but what you're willing to fight for. And Arnold was willing to fight, and his fights had real impact on me. He was one of the lobbyists who worked with the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights when they passed the 1957 Civil Rights Act, the 1960 Civil Rights Act, the 1964 Public Accommodations Act. And that was an interesting one for me personally, because that February, before it was passed, John Wilson, my college roommate, and I, and a couple hundred other students at UMES, University of Maryland, Eastern Shore, were arrested for trying to eat at Red Mirror's restaurant, and we ended up in jail. Well, that summer, this bill was passed. So Johnny and I got someone to drive us, and we went to Salisbury. And we went into every restaurant we could find. And every one of them served us. We ate so well that we were physically sick after that. That was a result of the work that was done by Arnold Mayer. I never thought I would become a lifelong friend with one of the heroes of that page of American history. The 1965 Voting Rights Act was another one that Arnold worked on and helped get passed. He was a strategist, by the way. Arnold didn't just go to the Capitol and sit down and talk to people about bills. He laid out strategies so that everyone else could. If you get Senator X and Y, that will mean you'll get the Senators A and B. And he worked the plans that way. These laws changed, making America a better place. He also worked on the OSHA bill. The OSHA bill saved thousands of lives and injuries of American workers. He also worked on a bill that had a personal effect on me and my family. We worked in a place called P.J. Ritter Canning Plant, and at that time you did not get overtime pay if you worked with fresh vegetables in a plant. Arnold helped change that law. The bill was changed first to 56 hours, after which you got overtime. Then it was changed to 48 hours, and then to 40 hours. Those 40 hours of pay for my family and me helped pay my way to college. So even my education, I owe in some measure to Arnold Mayer. When we had the thing in South Africa, we wanted people to be arrested at the South African embassy. And I asked Arnold if he would go, and he did. And we were arrested together. Now, he had to hang onto my arm so that we got to the jail. He didn't trip over stuff and fall. But he was there. Arnold Mayer was there. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Those ordinary people become extraordinary people. Arnold Mayer was an extraordinary person. Thank you.
Good afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, as the program indicates, I'm Arnold's cousin, one generation removed. My mom and Arnold were first cousins. Her father, Henry, was Arnold's uncle and was like a second father to Arnold. Arnold was like a second father to me. In the Jewish tradition, we say Lador Vador, from generation to generation. Family was very important to Arnold, and he was especially appreciative of his immediate family, including his grandmother Emma, who raised him in the US, his absolutely charming wife Vera, his daughters Anna, Sarah, and Emily, whom he adored, and his 4 beloved grandchildren. My wife Nita also loved and was loved by Arnold, and I want to give a shout out to her because she had the foresight and good judgment a few years ago to interview Arnold for an oral history, which formed the basis for a lot of what you heard about in the film. Now, the disadvantage of speaking after others and after the film is I'm going to repeat some of the same things that others have said. But because it's Arnold, it bears repeating and it gets to his essential character. He was the proud son of immigrant working class parents, and despite going to Yale University and often mingling with the elites of Washington, D.C., he never forgot his working class roots. In fact, as you've heard tonight, he dedicated his professional career to improving conditions for working class men and women everywhere. You've also heard that Arnold was a great storyteller. Many of the stories he told me were about his interactions with various politicians. There was a story about the time he lost his temper and got into an argument with Joe Biden on the Senate floor. The story about the first time he met Senator Joe Lieberman shortly after Lieberman defeated Lowell Weicker, whom Arnold's union, the UFCW, had supported in the recent election. And the story about his brief interaction with President Lyndon Johnson when Johnson signed the first food stamp bill, as well as many other stories about politicians, family, and friends. We would be talking about a subject, and it would remind him of one of these stories. TJ has talked about that, and he would say to me, "Did I ever tell you the story about X? Stop me if I have." And in my head, the answer was always, yes, I've heard this story, but stop him, I never did. Because I enjoyed hearing those stories over and over again, and he enjoyed telling them so much. Arnold was tough. He held his own with the most powerful members of Congress and his toughest union colleagues. I don't think he let himself be scared or intimidated by anyone, except maybe sometimes he was a little afraid of Vera. He would never let a bully get the best of him. I sensed he was able to do this because of an attitude, no one else is any better than me. At the same time, he also had an attitude that I am not better than anyone else. So he was just as impressed by the smarts of his housekeeper, an immigrant from Central America with barely any formal education, as he was by the most sophisticated Ivy League educated politician or reporter. And what he valued most in every person he knew was not their standing, prestige, or power, but rather the decency of their character. Arnold felt the pain of others and cared very much about doing the right thing. As you've heard tonight, because he had extreme nearsightedness, he never drove. Although he was offered the opportunity to learn, he declined to do so, not because he was concerned about hurting himself, but because his driving might pose a hazard to other people on the road. He was also grateful to others for every opportunity he was given. As you heard tonight, he went to Yale because they offered him a scholarship based on financial need. Many years later in life, he felt obligated to pay Yale back because of the opportunity that the scholarship had given him. Fortunately, the cost of tuition in the early 1950s, when he went to school, was much less than it was when he made his contributions in the early 2000s, so he could afford to donate an amount equal to the scholarship he had previously been given. A contribution that was used to fund a small scholarship for current financially needy youth. There are many things I will remember and miss about Arnold. The way he and Vera welcomed me into their home when I was a teenager, the insights I learned from him when discussing politics and negotiation, his self-deprecating sense of humor, his ability to have strong opinions, but also freely admit when he was wrong, and his warm smile and firm handshake whenever he greeted me. But like many of you, I am not here tonight to dwell on my sadness at his passing, but to celebrate his life. Arnold, Arnold, because of his humility and his sense of gratitude, would often say how fortunate he was to have so many good things fall in his lap, ignoring the role that his skill and determination and decency played in causing that good fortune. Tonight, I want to say how fortunate and grateful I feel to have known and loved Arnold Mayer.
Hi there. None of you know me, but my name is Rob Sullivan, and I am in a very small elite group known as Arnold Mayer's son-in-laws. I am married to Anna Sarah. Mike, I don't know where you are, but that is married to Emily. After hearing all of these speakers talk about all of the amazing things he's done for our country, I wanted to thank him for something that he did on a much smaller, though equally important level. As many of you may or may not know, Anna Sarah and Emily are adopted. This is not something that he had to do. If you've had raised kids before, you know how hard that is. They chose to do this. everything else he was doing, saving the planet, Vera saving the elderly. And yet they took the time to raise who are now just two of the most beautiful, wonderful human beings. I just wanted to make sure this got mentioned because he did so many huge things, but he also did so many small things. And it takes both to find that middle ground, and he did that so beautifully. So I just wanted to thank him for that and make sure that got mentioned. So, Arnold, we appreciate you, and we love you. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you to all of our speakers and guests for joining us this afternoon, this evening. Please remember to sign the guest book, which is on the memory table. And if you parked in the garage, to pick up your validation ticket, which will be on the greeters table.
And let's be sure to raise a glass of whatever you happen to be drinking to our Arnold Mayor. L'chaim. Thank you all.
Thank you.